Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Aloha. This is the final amendment to the bill, which will not kill the bill or send it back to committee. If adopted, the bill will immediately proceed to final passage as amended. Mr. Speaker, this amendment is simple. It would prohibit the EPA from relying on advice from any scientist whose primary source of research funding comes from corporations or individuals.
The House is not in order.
The gentleman from Hawaii will suspend. The gentleman from Georgia is correct. The House is not in order. The chair would again ask members to please take their conversations from the floor of the House. Would ask all members and all staff to please take their seats. The gentleman from Hawaii is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment will prohibit the EPA from relying on advice from any scientist whose primary source of research funding comes from corporations or individuals convicted of major environmental crimes. The Democratic motion to recommit would help ensure the integrity and the independence of EPA's scientific review process by prohibiting reliance on advice from those who are funded by the biggest abusers of our environment. Already this bill, the Secret Science Reform Act, would impose arbitrary, unnecessary, and expensive requirements that would seriously impede EPA's ability to use science to protect public health and the environment as required under an array of environmental laws while increasing uncertainty for businesses and states. This bill would stack the cards in favor of industry-backed data studies rather than the most reliable studies, and in doing so, prevent the EPA from using the best data possible to make decisions. Think about 50 years of tobacco-backed studies that lied about the effects of cigarette smoking to avoid labeling, regulation, and fines. That is the type of data that this bill wants the EPA to rely on to make decisions about our environment. Industry-backed data that shifts the favor to polluters, climate deniers, and those who do not have the best interests of public health and our environment in mind. This amendment would make sure that this data does not come from corporations or individuals that show disregard for our environmental laws, which is the main reason why the EPA exists in the first place. Consequences of H.R. 1030 could include the public release of industry-funded studies and data intended to bias the body of scientific evidence that the EPA is allowed to consider towards a particular industry position. For example, research that shows arsenic, mercury, or benzene is not bad for you could be in the majority of studies the EPA is allowed to base its recommendations and regulations on. Unfortunately, Republicans will claim that this bill increases the EPA's transparency and accountability by ensuring that its regulations are based on public data that can be verified and reproduced. In reality, Mr. Speaker, this bill would prevent the EPA from functioning effectively and by using the most relevant scientific data, including data that is legally protected from public disclosure. An effort to limit the scope of science that can be considered by EPA does not strengthen scientific integrity, but undermines it. The EPA relies on peer-reviewed scientific research from our universities as the backbone of their mission to protect public health and our environment. This amendment ensures that this data does not come from sources that routinely break our environmental laws. Because clinicians and researchers are legally prohibited from making the data publicly available, if this bill becomes law, the EPA would be forced to ignore this valuable research when protecting the public. At no point does this bill make the public safer, which is the fundamental function of government. The Secret Science Reform Act would only reduce the science available to the EPA on some of the most important decisions it makes. Mr. Speaker, over 30 of the most respected groups dedicated to scientific and health research have opposed this bill, and I urge our colleagues to do the same. However, before doing so, I urge our colleagues to vote for this common sense amendment to this bill. Again, all this amendment does is prohibit the EPA from relying on advice from any scientist whose primary source of research funding comes from corporations or individuals convicted of major environmental crime. This ensures the integrity and independence of...
The gentleman from Hawaii will suspend. Gentlelady is correct. Gentleman from Hawaii may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This ensures the integrity and independence of the EPA's scientific review process by prohibiting advice from those who are funded by the biggest abusers of our environment. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the Democratic motion to recommit, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Hawaii yields back.